In the course of preserving our freedoms, they are often put into harm's way. They see and experience things most of us could never imagine. They're asked to do things few of us would consider. And the toll it takes on them is showing. Tonight, shell shock and post-traumatic stress disorder. What is happening to our troops, and what can we do to help them readjust? I'm Ernie Manous, and this is Houston 8. They are willing to give up their lives for us. In the process, they give up so many other things: family, safety, security, and even in some cases, their psychological well-being. Today's headlines read of stress and violence that's destroying lives. There is help out there, but is it enough? An estimated 20% of veterans suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and 2008 has the distinction of being the year with the highest record of veteran suicides to date. In a time of limited troops, some enlist and find themselves sent back into combat time and time again. Some never get the chance to come home. Fact, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have each lasted longer than World War II. As the wars rage on, what is the psychological toll taken on our young men and women in today's armed forces? Joining us tonight are Captain W.O. King, U.S. Navy, retired; Marcus Smith, Outreach Specialist with the Vet Center, Houston; and Dr. John Vincent, Professor and Director of Clinical Psychology at the University of Houston. Welcome to all of you for joining us. I think I want to start right off at the top, and I'll start with Captain King on this, just so our audience understands as we have this discussion, the difference between stop-loss and redeployment.
Well, stop-loss was a program that was put into place to, when you're in an environment that people are getting out of the Navy or the services, to hold them for a while longer in order to keep your force numbers up. And so that's what stop-loss was.
And differs from redeployment, and redeployment is you come back and then you go back into the theater.
Yes. Essentially that's correct.
Okay. Dr. Vincent, is that part of the issue then with all of the rest of this that's going on? Are these two things tied together at all, do you think?
Well, they are in the sense that I think we all like to think there's a point at which something bad comes to an end. And if you have your heart set on getting to come home and suddenly that turns out not to be true, that's really difficult. Or if you have to go back and know that you're going to have to face horrific things again, the anticipation of that can be really difficult.
Okay, Marcus, what we're talking about is really ultimately nothing new, correct?
Correct. These types of things have been going on since the Vietnam War era, except for now with our newer generation, things have changed a little bit with the returning veterans. Right now they're younger, they're more energetic, and they want to do things when they get home, and they often fantasize about things that they want to do when they get home. In particular, reserves and National Guard members who are citizen soldiers or citizens normally first, and then service member last.
Now, I want to say, when we open the show, I don't want people to think we're saying every troop member that goes has these kind of issues that they face when they come home. This is some of the troops, and it seems to be growing in number with today's involvement in the wars we're involved with. But we can take it all the way back. I guess somewhere I saw in the Civil War, they referred to it as nostalgia. And then World War I had shell shock, World War II battle fatigue. Vietnam came up with post-Vietnam syndrome, and eventually we've put all of this together as post-traumatic stress disorder, correct?
Exactly, that's right. This is a phenomenon that's been documented ever since people have been in combat. We call it different things, and I think we have a better understanding now about what it really means. But this is not a new phenomenon.
With all the things we see in the headlines, and as recently as what just happened in the last week or so, people are tending to focus on it more. Are we actually seeing an increase in these kind of behaviors, or is this just the news media glomming onto something else to cover the war with?
Very difficult thing to say, because we don't have really good documentation over history to be able to see if the rates are actually going up. I think there are probably some circumstances around these combat situations that may actually increase the level of post-traumatic stress syndromes that are being reported. So there may well be a slight increase, but it's been around for a long time.
Well, and I would also think that this type of combat where you're also dealing with terrorists. A lot of the other combats are a bit more straightforward. The enemy's over the hill. We're sending them over there. You pretty much know where they are. They may be doing flanking maneuvers or whatever on the ground, but now they may be behind you. They may be in the area. They may be in the houses that you're working with. So the threat now is coming from different places. And I wouldn't blame it on the media, but the fact is when you have wars now where you can actually live in the United States watch bombs drop and watch rockets hit, we have instantaneous media. And I think that also brings on the fact that we have more information that's out. So perhaps if we don't have the records of the many years of people going through this, we do at least have probably more documentation of what's going on now.
You bring to mind an interesting point I want to ask Marcus about this desensitization of all of this. We see it on TV. There's so much more. We hear about it. Video games have such violence in them. We're surrounded by it. In some weird way, I would almost think it's more comfortable now because we're so exposed to that. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that's attributed to technology and the way it is today. Just like Captain King said, it's like we see it on the TV all the time. When it first happens, we lost so many service members in this battle or that battle. The first time America heard about it, it's like, whoa, it was really gut-wrenching. It was like, it really hit us hard. And then, after more and more takes of finding out more people are dying over there, America kind of got used to it, kind of like, almost, if you will, 9/11. Nowadays, when we relive it year after year and do our anniversary of it, we're a little bit more desensitized to actually what happened until we actually sit and just think exactly what happened, what's happening to these people out there.
But if we go with what you're saying, then, Dr. Vincent, why do we see the suicide rates higher? Why are we seeing these problems up in the piece said at the beginning, 20% of our troops are suffering from these things?
Well, I think there's a distinction between what we get to see in the media as kind of bystanders versus people who are actually in the field. And I think the ongoing repetitive confrontation with the possibility of violence, I think, really eats away at people. And I think that's exactly what happens. Suicide rates going up, and I think the link to that is depression. When we think about combat experiences, post-traumatic stress disorder is only one of the phenomena that we see, but we very often see serious problems with depression. Substance abuse is a way of trying to cope. So there's a whole constellation of bad things that can happen to people who are trying to grapple with these things.
Bizarre question. Any of you can take this and go with it, but is there any way to be mentally healthy and go to war?
That's a tough question.
That is a tough question.
That's a tough one, because everybody has different life experiences that also drive the experiences that they have when they get into a combat situation. I think a lot of it has to do with perhaps their own upbringing. If they lived in an environment where they actually, it was a very loving environment, then they might get into an environment such as combat, and all of a sudden we're talking about a total difference. But if you have someone that's from an area where they had to live with gunfire in their own neighborhood or gangs, and they get in that environment, I think their life experiences are going to have a lot to do. We see some type of, I'm not going to use a clinical terminology of post-traumatic stress, but we have people that come out of the hurricanes like we had that have some type of trauma. Mm-hmm. So it's not just as obviously not associated with military and combat, but certainly because that is a big part of what's going on in our lives right now. We're seeing a lot of it and hearing a lot about it.
I assume it's safe for all of us to assume that we know when people are in the theater, in the war zone, when they come back, they can't just be dropped into everyday society again, can they? I guess I'll ask that to Marcus.
No, they can't. And one of the things that it's been recognized that you can't make that transition successfully. So what the VA has done is come up with readjustment counseling positions such as throughout the regions of the United States. And what these readjustment counseling services do is try to help these transitioning veterans, whether they're still active duty or whether they're National Guard Reserves, to help them transition back from that civilian life once they're getting out. To come back and be a functional member of society.
But is that mandatory for every person returning that they get some kind of counseling?
They do go through, if you will, post-deployment training, PDHRAs, post-deployment health reassessments. and they are required to go through these. And it varies by service, but the Army has instituted something called Yellow Ribbon programs. And what they do is they bring service members back in phases, being, they have 7 phases that they go through. And they interact with their families as well as, other military members and, licensed professionals to basically ease them back into transition instead of just all at once.
Is that going on pretty much across the board?
I think it is. I think there's increasing sophistication about the impact that these kinds of experiences have, and I think we're getting smarter about what service men and women need when they come back.
I ask this because I was talking with a vet who said that their discharge training, it was relatively brief. It was a group of them in a room. They were spoken to about 2 hours by a chaplain, not even a medical expert, saying, you're probably going to have some problems. Make sure you talk to people about it. And they were sent home, and with the understanding that if they had said, I don't feel ready, that's the worst thing they wanted to say at that point because they didn't want to stay in. At that point, they want to come out. So that maybe they're not getting the attention they need.
Obviously, 2 hours is not sufficient, and I think understanding that this is a gradual process, the sooner it can be begun, the better. And certainly it needs to extend well beyond when they are about to leave to back when they are actually home. And this is not just for the service person themselves, but also their family, so that the family can understand this is what you're likely to experience, this is what you're likely to see, this is how you can help. These are some things that will not be helpful.
Mm-hmm. I think there's things available. I'm not sure how, it's been a while since I've been on active duty, but I'm not sure how good our services are now in getting that word out. I think some are better than the others, and I think obviously our discharge procedures are not necessarily standardized across the board. That's unsatisfactory to have that type of discharge briefing or whatever it is. But it's also incumbent in the service for each one to keep an eye on each other. People just don't seem to want to admit, when they've got a problem, and the doctor could probably confirm that. So it's a commanding officer, and I was a commanding officer, and it was my responsibility for every person in my command. So even though I may not have known everyone, depending on the size of the command, it still was my responsibility to know their fitness.
But to say you have an issue of these sorts that we're discussing now within the military, you are then, in a sense, as I understand it, somewhat ostracized. You're not probably going to get the promotions you want. If they hear that you have a record of maybe some kind of psychological disorder, which all of these would fall under, that's going to be a stigma you're carrying. And if that is, in fact, the case, I would assume people that are having these issues are not going to bring them forward for fear of cutting short their career or limiting what they can do. Marcus?
Yes, the stigma is a major drawback for some of these service members. They're proud. They don't want to admit that they have problems. Sometimes they don't even know that they have issues. The active duty portion of it, they have their professionals that they can deal with. But the veteran, once they get out, you have lots of resources back here, especially in the Houston area. You got things from the medical center, the Michael E. DeBakey Medical Center, as well as what we do at the vet centers. And that's one of the things that we try to talk to these service members about is the stigma of saying nothing's wrong with me, I don't need help. That's another reason why we start talking to the families, because we get the families involved to let the service member know, hey, maybe you do have some issues.
I hear from a service member who has left and come back to Houston and was having issues. So he goes to get into one of these programs, and that you have to justify your way in such a way. And he said with the conditions he was facing, the last thing in the world he wanted to have to do was defend why he needed this help, and yet he felt he was being grilled all over again. Is there a way that we can do this in a more humane and easy way to get these people the help they need?
Well, definitely. The services have been revamped, and before, when they came out back in like 2001 or so, they were need to be fine-tuned. Now they're fine-tuned. They actually have an office, an actual clinic dedicated to Iraq and Afghanistan veterans at the hospital. In addition to, we have the vet centers. They're community-based, so they're the service member doesn't have to worry about going over to the VA hospital. They can come out into these community-based centers and actually talk to people in normal clothes. Warm environments, and can discuss all of the things that they need to discuss in a timely manner.
Dr. Vincent?
Yeah. One thing I want to say, I think the stigma issue is a real biggie, and I tend to think of post-traumatic stress reactions as basically almost a normal reaction to a catastrophic situation. I think you put any of us in certain kinds of situations, and we are going to exhibit many of the kinds of, quote, symptoms that people associate with post-traumatic stress disorder. So the pathologizing of that reaction, I think, is part of the problem. I would like to think that we can change our thinking and our language about this is not, at least to my way of thinking, as much of a mental disorder as it is, again, a human reaction given the way our nervous systems are wired up and how we deal with intense fear and exposure to really awful things.
And to add on to that, I'd say, too, in everyday life,
Yes.
if somebody exhibits psychiatric concerns,
Sure.
we stigmatize them just as a community. Imagine put in the military. I do also understand that in the military, if in fact you do exhibit a problem or have issues with this, that it's your commanding officer that decides whether you're going back into combat or not a medical officer.
Well,
Is that correct?
I can't verify that now. I would say that the commanding officer is probably the first person in line, and yeah, he or she may have a large input depending on what they know about the individual. And again, you're looking not just at the mental health of which the commanding officer certainly would not be an expert, but you're looking at the entire performance of an individual. That individual might have been a marginal player at some point in time, and he or she may be using this as a way to avoid some type of service. It's a tough position to be in, but the fact is those things do happen.
But should the commanding officer be the one to make that judgment, or should you put it to a medical expert who can say whether or not these are?
I would say that most commanding officers, if I were in that position and I had a sailor who was exhibiting that or talking about it, I certainly would look for medical help. I would not try to do that on my own. I realize what my limitations are from the standpoint of what my qualifications are to be able to diagnose something like that. Are there commanding officers that would probably do it? Yes. Just like in any profession we go into, some people are going to make decisions that they shouldn't be making.
All right. I also want to say, too, before we get into talking about what we can do in the community and stuff, when you're in the military and all of this is going on and you're being faced with what you're being faced with, are there ways that people watching now that might be in those situations, are there things they can do to help themselves through traumatic experiences before it gets to the aftermath?
Right. One of the things that I think is probably the hallmark of how most of us cope is that we try to avoid dealing with things. The case of trauma reactions, in fact, one of the clusters that go into the diagnosis is this notion of avoidance. We try not to think about it. We try to stay away from situations that represent whatever that trauma is or was. And I think generally we know that it's better when people are able to expose themselves to what they've experienced, both in terms of thinking about it and talking about it. So if you find somebody who is closing up, they're avoiding interactions with people they care about, they're trying to manage this themselves, that's a bit of a red flag. And I think in terms of helping somebody realize there is a better way to deal with it, that would be one of the hallmarks that I would look at.
Mm-hmm. I would also say that camaraderie is a big thing that helps cope. Because when I was in Iraq, there's some things that, all of us, all we knew is that we had each other. We didn't have, we can't depend on the people at home because we're too far away from them. Their thoughts and prayers are always with us, but the best thing that we can do is make sure that we revert back to our training and the people that are around us.
Mm-hmm. When you do come home, and God willing, as many will come home as possible, the way we interact, we as a community, what should we be looking for? If you're a family member of mine and you come back, what should I be aware of or watch for so that if I see these things, I can get you the help you need as soon as possible?
Well, what we've been seeing is a lot of withdrawal, anger, alcohol abuse, and things of that nature. But let's say withdrawal, anxiety, difficulty sleeping, things of that nature.
And if you see these?
If you see these, what we tell our family members to do is call somebody. It doesn't have to be us. It doesn't have to be, the VA. It's somebody, because there are lots of help out there. We've got Military One Source that helps out. They have free counseling. The city of Houston even has reaction teams that can help out in certain instances, and then we have toll-free numbers to vet centers across the nation that you can call. Then there's also always emergency help, 911, if it really feels that, it's out of hand. These family members can call them for emergency help.
I think whenever we talk about a subject like this, a lot of our audience will automatically think of Vietnam and Vietnam vets. Is this a similar situation? Is it different? How do you compare them?
Well, I think in the case of Vietnam, there was such political tension around the whole issue that we certainly saw many returning vets who were basically humiliated for having served. I don't see that quite so much with these wars, but certainly our ability to help people make that transition back and thank them and welcome them and let them know how much we appreciate everything they've done for us helps a great deal. The idea that you would be shunned, which I think did happen in Vietnam, is, I think, just an awful, awful thing.
Captain King?
I would agree. I think that's a huge difference in what's going on now. I think the troops do feel the support that they're getting. There's any number of things, any number of organizations that are doing it. But even when they're coming back and the welcome home things the sessions that they're getting. But I agree. Vietnam was an awful thing for the returning.
Right. Marcus, when people come back, I hear the term of triggers. There are certain things that can start an episode. What are some triggers to watch for, and is it something that there are categories of these, or is it different for each individual?
It varies for an individual based on the actual traumatic event. I'm not a licensed professional. All of our counselors, they deal with that. But I have noticed from the peer mentoring that I've been doing with returning service members, it's little things, slamming the door too hard, fireworks during the 4th of July or New Year's Eve, or even just driving down the street because they want to drive. They're vigilant. They drive fast. They haven't toned down yet. They don't want to, make sure that they get caught up in any, IEDs or anything like that. So it's different things, and it varies.
Dr. Vincent?
Anything that's linked to what happened, I think, can potentially be a trigger. A sight, a smell. I've seen people who, can remember a particular sound that links back to what they experienced in combat. Had a fellow I worked with years ago who had this intense reaction to flies. He was a Vietnam vet, and turned out he had some pretty grisly work he had to do, and the link to the flies was because of what he had to do in getting some fallen soldiers back. So, it's very individual. But you'll see these very intense reactions that often to people on the outside don't make sense because they seem, what's this all about? But once you know the story, you completely get it, why that particular event has the effect it does.
And again, I want to say, I'm assuming everyone that's been over there has experienced something that most of us cannot relate to unless we've also been over there. But that a lot of people will handle it perfectly fine, and or whatever fine is in this situation, but will be able to get through it, and that there are some that do need help, and that there should be no stigma to needing the help, because what they've done for us has been a great gift.
Absolutely.
In talking about the things that set them off and all of that, and I fall into this category all the time, I'm curious, what was it like there? And any of my friends that return, I want to talk to them about it, and I'm asking, and they usually give me initially the first answer is, I don't want to talk about that. Push, not push. What do you do? There's that curiosity. I'm sure that how do you handle that?
I think you don't push. I think you let people tell the story when they are ready, if they are ready. But I think the idea of trying to get somebody to think about something or talk about something before they're ready is not helpful. So next time you can curb your curiosity.
Well, and I've noticed, usually after they say they don't want to talk about it, they will start to tell some of the stuff.
Right.
And I think that it's in some way therapeutic for them. They need somewhere to talk.
Right. I agree completely. And I think that's part of the issue, though. It's one of timing. It's when you're ready. As I said before, one of the most important things for people to do is to begin finding a place that's safe, where they can talk about what happened, where they can process the emotions. But you have to be ready to do that, or it's going to be actually more difficult and not helpful.
As we run out of time, Captain King, closing
Well,
thoughts on
I was
all?
just was thinking that I've run across a number of vets, even from World War I. There are not many now, but a lot of them would not talk about their experiences in World War I. So it's not a new, obviously not a new phenomenon.
No.
World War I, Vietnam, World War II. There was some rich information that we could have gotten from those folks, but they just wouldn't talk about their experiences. And I agree, you can't press that issue with them.
Yeah. And Marcus, to wrap us up this afternoon?
And we experience some of the same things nowadays. We have groups. We have Vietnam groups. We have, Korean War veterans. We got our newer OEF and OIF groups. And then sometimes they function better in groups, sometimes better in individuals, sometimes formal settings, sometimes less formal settings. So it varies.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming and talking with us. And information will be on our website. And this is the point that I'm going to tell them about it. Because now each week we invite you to visit our home online at HoustonPBS.org. Simply click on the local programs bar, pick Houston 8, and you can join our online community. Read about the guests, learn more about the topic, share your thoughts and ideas, and even suggest questions that we might ask during upcoming episodes. Remember, information posted on our website may be used on air, so keep that in mind when submitting. That does it for us tonight. Until next time, I'm Ernie Manous. Thank you for joining us, and have a great week.